Hi everyone, thank you for the opportunity to speak at the New Alternatives Conference. It really is a great honor to be invited to speak today at the first national conference for people with a psychosocial disability in Korea. And I sincerely hope that today will provide an opportunity for new conversations and understanding to flow about the life and experiences and needs of people with a psychosocial disability. My name is Neil, and Neil Turton-Lane, and I'm a part of the leadership team at the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council in Melbourne, Australia. In Melbourne at the moment, due to COVID-19, we're pretty much in full lockdown, so everyone's working from home, businesses have closed. Yeah, things are a bit serious, but we're hoping that we can, in a couple of weeks, we can come out the other end of all this. I'd just like to, before I go any further, acknowledge the Aboriginal people, the traditional custodians of the land here in Australia on which I am meeting with you, and their land was never ceded, it was taken away, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Okay, so I have to say this is a first for me. It's definitely a first for me to record a presentation via Zoom. So please bear with me if at times it gets a little bit clunky. I'll try my best, but together I hope the talk will flow nicely for you. So in my talk today, I'll be sharing some personal reflections about the peer movement here in Australia, which is also referred to as the consumer movement, and to be more kind of like embracing, I guess, the consumer survivor exploitation movement. So within this movement, this very diverse movement, as are other social, civil and human rights movements, there is a whole lot of stuff going on, which together collectively informs us as a movement about where we are at and where we need to go. Excuse me. Okay, so in my speech today, I'll be talking about the history of the peer movement in Australia. I'll be also kind of discussing where the peer movement is landing now. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the services and supports that can really make a difference and assist people on their recovery journey. Many of these are peer delivered and kind of like conceived. And finally, I'll talk about a little bit about what needs to change and what's really important for the peer movement, or what I believe is really important for the peer movement moving forward. And so that things can change and people with a psychosocial disability can find their rightful place as valued and contributing members of our societies. So, all right, so firstly, a little bit about myself. My name is Neil Turton-Lane, and I manage a team of advocates at the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council. The Victorian, it's an organisation that's totally led and run by people with a lived experience of mental illness or distress. And it's been around for a while, about 40 years now. And so today I'm going to begin by sharing a little bit about my own experience and story of mental illness and recovery, just because I feel it gives a bit of context to the rest of my, bit of a framework to the rest of my talk. Not that it's that terribly interesting or anything, but yeah, it's typical, I think, of many people's experiences. Right, so I guess my illness recovery story kind of started some 40 odd years ago when I found myself in a psych hospital in Melbourne. It wasn't the first time. I'd been admitted a few months earlier, picked up by police wandering the streets, and picked up, but found myself back in hospital and kind of put into kind of a long stay unit at Royal Park in Melbourne, where I stayed for over a year. So I stayed there a year, and when I left, I was discharged and with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, a prescription for medication, and to be honest, not a great deal else. Yeah. So over the next 10 years until my early 30s, when things started to settle down for myself, I spent a lot of time kind of bumping in and out of the mental health system, the psych hospitals in Victoria. My mental health kind of really fluctuated a lot. I went through periods where I was kind of relatively stable, able to work, hold down a job, so forth. And then I would get unwell, and often I'd find myself kind of homeless or near to homeless and admitted into hospital again. And so that was a bit of a pattern through my 20s. And it's been an experience that that kind of has led me to kind of like have some doubts about the mental health system. For the past 20 or so years, I've also kind of worked extensively in mental health, in kind of consumer peer roles, but I do feel that our system is a very limited one of supporting people. The kind of the focus on medical treatment of kind of medication and not a great deal much else. I feel it's very kind of limiting and not really what I believe is the answer. Right, so I'm going to begin now. I'm going to share a couple of slides, so just bear with me as I share my screen and kind of, right, I think that's right, we're sharing, and all right, so here's my presentation. Come on, work, yeah, okay. All right, so this is the beginning of my PowerPoint. It's only a few slides, but I guess they're talking points for what I want to discuss today. And here on this title page, you have a photo of the Great Barrier Reef, which is in Australia. It's a photo of it, and you can see there's a little coral island I hope it's not being photoshopped bad of a heart. Just a lovely sentiment, but and a bit of a Australiana for you. So please enjoy. Right. So in talking about the mental health system in Australia, both then and I guess now, as I say, I still work in the system, and though I have seen some change, there's definitely not enough. And you know, yeah. And so what we see, and this is a cartoon by a friend and colleague of mine, Marinda Epstein, who's really, I would say, is kind of, I feel is the kind of godmother, the grand auntie of the consumer movement in Australia. Marinda's an amazing person. She's a cartoonist, writer, thinker, activist, done some incredibly amazing work. Yeah, and I just really love this cartoon. It's called Desperation, and in the cartoon you can see two people climbing the walls of the psychiatric system, and one of those people is desperately trying to get in, trying to get some help and support, and then there's another person really desperately trying to get out, and that, you know, and an escape system that's just really not fit for purpose, that is in kind of like, you know, can be inhumane and intolerable, and it's just not set up or doesn't really kind of work that well. So I love this kind of commentary on our mental health system. Yeah, desperation. All right, so I'll just leave that slide up while I talk a little bit about my own personal experience. So, you know, here I was in my 20s. I've been told that because of my diagnosis of schizophrenia, it was likely that I would never be able to work or hold down a job, maintain a relationship, have a family, raise children. I mean, all the things that I was I'm not really expecting, but, you know, were part of the package of kind of growing up. And yeah, so my dreams were shattered by my experience in the mental health system. I went there looking for help and support, and it's not really what I got. And how I was treated by other people kind of really impacted on me deeply for a very long time. Yeah, and it really kind of like brings to mind to me that kind of, you know, that idea that you know, in our mental health systems across the world, we have something called the soft bigotry of low expectations. That's that you know, we'll maintain and stabilize you, but we want to assist you kind of to get back into life greatly, get on with things. Well, that's been the way that it has been, our system has been, and, you know, I would say a lot still needs to change in mental health. We very much need a new understanding about mental health. So it was around this time, you know, when I was, you know, so I kind of like spiraled through my 20s in and out of crisis, and got to my 30s, and that's when I met up with Anne was someone who I'd known prior to getting unwell. We kind of like were boyfriend, girlfriend for a little while when I was 17 and 18. And unfortunately, So, well, fortunately, really, I began a relationship with Anne, and for the next 25 years, Anne was my partner, and unfortunately, several years ago, she passed away. So she's no longer with us, but she certainly has left a legacy, not only in my own life, but in the work that she's done. And so, Anne was a very kind, generous, and loving person. She was a very talented filmmaker, writer, and poet who had a very political take on life, and who enabled and encouraged me to grow and look at my own life differently. And in the time together, we spent a lot of time kind of, we escaped to the country and kind of led a very kind of like pleasant life. We spent a lot of time reading and discussing kind of and critiquing the mental health system, reading writers like Sars, Cooper, Lang, Goffman, Foucault, and these writers and these ideas, though they weren't really that new to me, because I kind of picked up on some of this stuff when I was younger. They really, at that time, really started to sink into me and give me a bit of a sense about not only kind of allowed me to create my own kind of narrative, my own story about what had happened to me, and provided me with the support and inspiration to move forward in my own recovery. So, though I'm not really here today to kind of talk at length about what happened to me or my own personal story of illness and recovery, and part of the reason for that is just because, honestly, it's just not that interesting. But really, my talk today is about something else, and it really, and it is about the peer movement. And what I will say is that without the care and support of my peers, that being other people with a lived experience of mental illness, I doubt I would have been able to make it through to today and be with you. I very much believe, more than anything else, it has been the example, guidance, mutual support, and inspiration that I've gained through my contact with my peers that has enabled me to overcome the barriers, challenges, and discrimination that I've faced, and that internally, I guess, that I live with every day. So I guess that really brings me around to the topic of my talk today, which is around the peer movement in Australia. And as you'll hear, it's a movement that's been around for a while. And, in Australia, it's been around for over 40 years. And though, kind of small in size, it's a movement that really punches above its weight and is growing in influence and support, and is being recognised both within the mental health system and across our wider community. So, kind of, what I'm going to do now, bear with me, I'm just going to have a sip of water, have a breather, but okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the consumer movement in Australia. Okay, all right, so we do have a history. It's kind of never been properly written, but hopefully it will be one day. Merinda Epstein has written a book about the consumer movement in Australia. Her memoirs, as an old campaigner and an activist. Good on you, Miranda. And in this book, which I find really delightful and really kind of informative, she talks about the early days of the consumer movement in Australia, which really kind of kicked off in the early 1970s. In the mid 1970s, at the time of kind of the Vietnam War, the civil unrest protests, kind of radical, student politics and all that. She talks about a group, some groups that were around at that time, the first kind of consumer groups in Australia, and one of them was called the Campaign Against Psychiatric Injustice and Coercion, or CAPIC. And so I'm just going to read a little bit about from Miranda's book, just share a little bit of a sense for you about what it was like. These are the thoughts and recollections of someone who was there right at the beginning of the consumer movement in Australia, and I hope they're things that it's writing that you can appreciate. All right, so Miranda writes that CAPIC, this group, represented a very radical anti-psychiatry position. Its members would turn up at all sorts of official events and demand change. Demand psychiatrists be sued for harm caused by a variety of contemporary practices. There were many other radical groups fighting for human rights at this time. It was the era that I wish could have stayed forever. But that is not how history works. CAPIC was the right movement for its time. Many small activism groups were supported by the non-government sector. In those days, the psychiatric disability support sector was poor and radical. We could rely on impoverished small organisations to house us, support us, and even help us to charge the barricades of the service system. We had a common enemy out there rather than an enemy within, which is all too common these days, regardless of the employment of consumers within the sector. All these groups were also supported by a highly politicized university student sector. All right, so that's just a little bit from Miranda's book. I highly recommend you look up Miranda Epstein and look at some of the many books she's written on consumer politics and the movement. So that was the mid-70s, and over time, as Australia moved into the 80s, things took a new turn. And I might just move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is a bit of a timeline of the consumer movement. So in the mid-70s, we had the ex-patients groups. They kind of all formed around the ideas of anti-psychiatry, and they were very much into protesting and challenging the psychiatric system around its human rights abuses. Very radical kind of group, known to kind of like break people out of psych hospitals and spirit them away to safety. So over time anyway, that kind of radical movement, kind of that civil rights movement, kind of like faded away in Australia and was kind of replaced by a different world. And and that different world that's still a very interesting world and informed by the kind of politics of that time. And in 1981, in the International Year of the Disabled, the organisation that I work for, the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council, was formed by a small group of activists as a means to bring people with a diagnosis of mental illness into the public consciousness. It was a protest in the International Year of the Disabled during a time when a lot of events were being held right across Australia to promote the civil and human rights of disabled people. There had been absolutely no recognition or awareness given to the terrible disadvantage experienced by people living with a psychosocial disability, many of whom were still living in the institutions or else living very precariously and unsupported in the community. Sorry, that's my cat outside the door, if you can hear it. Yeah, his name's Cicero, he's very vocal. Okay, so moving forward, so in 1981, the first consumer advocacy organisation, VMIAC, was formed. And moving forward, in 1986, a couple of the workers at VMIAC, which kind of operated on a real shoestring budget, they started up an amazing kind of project called the Understanding and Involvement, or UNI project, and it really was a pioneering project. It was a consumer participatory action research project of a psychiatric hospital, and involved both and kind of examined and explored the experiences and feelings of psych patients and mental health staff together. So moving forward from that time, in 1991, excuse me, in 1991, in Australia, there was this horrible kind of situation where quite a lot of people who were being treated in a private hospital in Sydney died as a result of this very kind of dodgy kind of treatment using deep sleep therapy. And when this was exposed, the news came out, there was a huge outcry, and the government called a public inquiry into the mental health system in Victoria. The inquiry was led by the then Human Rights Commissioner, and out of that inquiry there are kind of a range of recommendations, but probably the most important one was a recommendation that the experiences of people with a lived experience, of patients, of consumers, that needed to be kind of like a very kind of important part of kind of the kind of evaluation and quality control of the mental health system. So that was adopted in our kind of first national mental health plan, and kind of embedded into kind of our standards. So moving forward, in 1996, the first kind of consumer consultant roles were kind of created, and these roles really were kind of an opportunity for people with a lived experience to to work as change agents within the psychiatric system, capturing patients' experiences and feedback, and kind of like working with management to improve how services could be designed and delivered. So it was around 2000, the turn of the century. That's when I first started working in mental health. Around this time, kind of consumer lived experience peer roles started appearing outside of the psychiatric system, and they were popping up in much more kind of progressive kind of I guess liberal psychosocial rehabilitation and support services. That were run by non-government organisations and that operated from a strengths-based kind of recovery focus, community-based services that were kind of set up to support people to stay well in the community, stay out of hospital, and so forth. So moving forward again, around that same time, the first kind of peer-run operated service kind of started in Queensland, the Brook Red Centre, so that was wonderful. And in 2008, the first kind of consumer role within the mental health branch of the government kind of was established, and that was a policy role around informing how consumers could play a bigger and more deeper part in the mental health system. In 2010, Voices Vic was established to kind of spread news and training around the hearing voices approach, and Voices Vic was hugely influential in kind of again sort of further popularizing kind of peer support and peer delivered kind of services and training within our communities. Right, and so like by 2015, 2016, there really was recognition and a place for the consumer workforce in mental health. That being said, it wasn't probably the most kind of important kind of place that the consumer movement was happening, because at a much broader level, it had kind of like, with the advent of the internet and social media, Facebook groups and so on, the peer movement had really kind of like just kind of exploded, and there are so many more people who kind of were connected together about the important messages that were contained in the consumer peer movement, psych survivor kind of movement. So which kind of leads us to where we are at now, and I'll just talk about that kind of, briefly, and what I'll, so this is a really lovely kind of graphic that was created by some work done by the Centre for Mental Health Learning. It was kind of created by a consumer academic and a peer worker at CMHL, and I just really love this graphic because speaking about the workforce, you can really get a sense about how kind of peer work has kind of evolved and matured in right across Australia, and you can see there are a variety of roles which are really informed by the lived experience of people and communities, but have kind of created quite a diverse range of roles where people can work within the mental health system if they so choose. And some of those work roles are around peer support. They're also around kind of individual advocacy or systemic advocacy, research, policy, and kind of supervision and leadership. So yeah, so that's kind of happening in the mental health space, in the mental health sector space. But as I mentioned, there's a vastly much bigger and more important kind of movement that's happening kind of online and with people through various kind of Facebook groups and kind of like collectives and so forth. So, it's been really kind of gratifying to witness in my time kind of working in mental health, the evolution of kind of consumer work, and see it kind of grow in diversity and specialization, see new people come on board, next generation of activists, and part of it is really kind of gratifying to see that, we now have consumer academics. Well, and truly we have mad studies, we have people working in our institutions of learning. So I feel the kind of consumer movement has really kind of like come of its own in the last 10 years. Right, so there are some really excellent resources where if you're inclined, you can read more about the peer movement, the consumer movement in Australia. I'd highly recommend the lived experience framework, which has kind of been created by Queensland Health, or they funded it, and was kind of the work of a team of consumer academics. And again, another resource is the Peer Inside website, which is part of the Centre for Mental Health Learning website. And so go there for a bit of a heads up about what's happening in the consumer movement in Australia. Okay, all right, so now I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more brief about, how the consumer movement is kind of supporting people on their own individual recovery journeys. And so that's happening in a number of ways, but central to that is
무와 상관없이 신속하게 검사를 하시고 방역 당국의 역학조사 및 경위 조치에 적극적으로 협조해 주시는
제가 말해도 되는 건가요? 저희가 시간 관계상 미의 동영상을 좀 일부 생략을 했습니다. 나중에 그 녹화 영상 올릴 때는 이제 전부를 다 해서 올리도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 저희가 이제 시간이 없어가지고 번역 자막다는 걸 체크를 못했거든요. 일부 좀 약간 좀 불충분한 게 있는데 그거 다 수정해가지고 나중에 여러분 보실 때는 좀 편하게 볼 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 지금 닐이 접속해 있기 때문에 닐을 초청해서 이야기를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. Hi Neil, do you hear me?
I certainly can. Yes, hi. Is that Jay?
Okay. Thank you very much for thank you very much for your participation in the conference and so wonderful presentation. We will shorten your presentation because of time limitations. So we will show your full recordings on the in the next times. We invite three panelists. So Siwan Yu and Jaewon Kim. So they are they are a peer movement leader in Korea. And so another panelist is Yongpyo Lee, who is a professor who has long been involved in the reformation of the Korean psychiatric systems.
Excellent.
They will ask you some questions on your presentation and so about the Australian peer movement. So let's start.
Okay.
네, 제가 질문 드리겠습니다. 안녕하세요. 저는 한국정신장애인 자료집은 소장 유시완입니다. 저는 2002년도부터 이제 정신과 약물을 먹으면서 실제로 당사자 활동은 2012년도 경부터 했습니다. 네, 그러면서 좀 느낀 점이 있습니다. 또 물론 이제 질문 드리고 싶은 점과 같은 내용이고요. 그 정신장애 활동가 리더들이 이제 당사자가 의료 소비자로서 그래도 생존자로서 어떻게 보면 이제 자기결정권을 충분히 발휘하려면 이 당사자 후임의 당사자분들 그리고 이제 시민사회의 어떤 방향성을 갖고 그런 것들을 관철시켜야 되는지 좀 여쭤보고 싶은데 예시로 들면 그 지역에서 뭔가를 동료 당사자의 그 뭔가 쉼터나 아니면 뭐 센터나 당사자 단체에 그 명칭을 달고 이제 간판을 달고 하려고 할 때 많이 지역에 입주하는 것부터 그 난관이 많이 있었습니다. 그래서 저희 센터만을 해도 간판을 달지 않았습니다. 그 이유는 혹시나 그 지역에서 지역 상가나 이런 데서 이제 좀 부정적인 요소로 인식을 할까봐 저희가 그 외부 간판을 달지 않았거든요. 네, 하여튼 그런 과정에서 지역 주민과 시민사회가 거부감 없이 이런 그 지역의 정신장애 동료 지원이 제대로 도움이 되려면 어떻게 해야 되는지 한번 제언을 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다.
So we invite a PhD candidate, Yoo-jung Kim. She helps translation to you.
So his question was, what should the peers as survivors and neighbors in the community do to exercise the right to self-determination of people with mental disorders? In some cases, there are conflicts among the stakeholders. For instance, neighbors in the community might not necessarily agree with what the peers have to say. He brought up one example that there was a disagreement with the name of the center, and so they could not put their name outside the building because the people in the community said that it might degrade the image of the community. So how can we minimize the conflicts among the stakeholders, and what do we need to prepare for it?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and but some of the answers lie in changing the perceptions that people have about people with a mental illness, and that kind of needs to happen on a range of fronts. It needs to happen through kind of education. It needs to happen through the sharing of stories about people as not as people being able to contribute much to society, and the sharing of stories about that with the right support, that people with a psychosocial disability have a very important part to play in our society. I believe that it needs to be tackled on a lot of fronts, and I think the human rights issues are paramount, and getting support of allies within the legal system in Australia has been certainly a real assistance in changing some of the ideas and thinking about mental illness in Australia. So seeking out allies, they're in the community, but kind of creating opportunities where people can work together towards change.
예, 지금 말씀하신 것은 이제 상당히 이제 어려운 과제이긴 하지만 교육을 통해서 이제 일반 대중들에 대한 교육을 통해서 그러한 그러니까 스티그마들을 이렇게 이겨내는 것도 상당히 중요한 부분이라고 말씀하시고요. 또 다른 한편에서는 이제 동료 운동을 하는 사람들이 사회에 대한 그러니까 우리가 실제로 하는 일들에 대한 기여적인 일들, 우리가 하는 활동들이 사회의 이제 정신건강 문제를 해소하는 데 큰 기여를 하고 있다라고 하는 것을 보여주고 있는 것도 굉장히 중요하다고 이야기합니다. 그리고 정신건강 시스템에서 이런 동료 지원들의 활동들이 굉장히 중요한 부분이다라고 하는 것들을 이제 확인시켜주는 것도 중요한 부분인 것 같고요. 또 인권이라고 하는 것이 가장 중요한 가치이고, 그리고 그런 측면에서 우리 사회에서 이것을 더 뒷받침해 줄 수 있는 동맹자들을 같이 찾는 것도 굉장히 중요한 부분이라고 말씀하셨습니다. And then so the next panelist is 재원 김.
예, 저는 송파 정신장애 동료지원센터에서 온 김재완이라고 합니다. 예, 저는 신출대기 동료지원관인데요. 제가 지금 기관에서 동료지원과 교육을 맡고 있었어요. 지금 현재 저희가 교육을 이제 이수한 동료들에게 민간 자격증이라도 지금 지급을 하려고 생각을 하고 있는데요. 선생님께서 보시기에는 동료 지원과의 자격을 객관적으로나 아니면 계량적으로 판단할 수 있을지, 만약 그렇다면 그것이 가능하다면은 동료 지원의 성과 역시도 객관적으로 지목될 수 있는 건지 좀 여쭤봤으면 좋겠습니다.
So his question was, can we evaluate the qualifications of peer specialists and their accomplishments objectively and quantitatively?
Yes, I believe you can do that, absolutely.